they once worked together a long time ago. They're not friends now. They don't like each other. And yeah, 50 has taken every shot, especially when Diddy has been.
He said he's speaking out because he believes Diddy's a predator. He wants accountability, and he doesn't want someone like this to run unchecked.
What if the most dangerous evidence against a powerful man wasn't leaked by enemies, but recorded by himself? What if the cameras he trusted to protect his legacy became the weapons that destroyed it? Because once you hear what's still hidden, you'll realize this story was never just about one man, it's about how power really collapses. What began as opportunity, access to power, proximity to fame, the seductive illusion of mentorship, slowly revealed itself as something far more corrosive and deeply entrenched. What looked like generosity was, in truth, leverage carefully extended. What felt like protection was control exercised with precision. And what passed for loyalty was silence, rewarded when convenient and punished when broken. For years, this system didn't survive because it was invisible. It survived because it was profitable, too profitable to challenge. Everyone who stepped inside it understood the unspoken contract without ever needing it spelled out. Stay close to the source of power, don't ask uncomfortable questions, don't notice what isn't meant to be seen, and above all, don't speak. In exchange, the rewards would continue: money, access, relevance, safety from scrutiny. As long as the benefits flowed, the moral cost of silence felt easier to justify than the personal risk of truth. That illusion of stability collapsed the moment the documentary went public. When it finally dropped, the reaction was immediate and explosive, like a controlled demolition exposing the fragile structure beneath a polished exterior. Celebrities scrambled to respond, issuing statements, clarifications, half-denials, and moral posturing, each one unintentionally revealing the cracks in a wall that had stood for decades. Every reaction felt defensive, rushed, and telling. It wasn't just about distancing from Diddy, it was about rewriting personal history in real time. Ja Rule dismissed 50 Cent as a dry snitch, attempting to reframe accountability as betrayal, as if exposing wrongdoing were more offensive than the wrongdoing itself. The message was clear: silence was still the expected currency, speaking out was the real violation. Marlon Wayans took a different approach, publicly warning about karma, positioning himself above the mess, as if moral distance could be declared after the fact. But within hours, that image unraveled. 50 reposted archived footage of Wayans smiling comfortably at Diddy's infamous parties, fully present, fully complicit in the culture he now claimed to condemn. The contrast was unforgiving: public righteousness versus private participation. The warning didn't just fall flat, it collapsed under the weight of its own hypocrisy. In that moment, something fundamental shifted. The documentary stopped being just an exposé of one powerful figure and became a mirror held up to everyone orbiting him. It forced uncomfortable questions into the open. Who knew? Who benefited? Who stayed silent because silence was easier, safer, more profitable? The cracks spreading through those reactions made one thing painfully clear: this wasn't about a single downfall. It was about a collective reckoning, one that many people had spent years hoping would never arrive. Joe Budden took a sharper, far more dangerous position, one that deliberately avoided personalities and instead aimed straight at the structure beneath them. He argued that the documentary wasn't really about Diddy's alleged crimes in isolation. It was about the ecosystem that allowed those crimes to exist, to repeat, and to be quietly absorbed without consequence for years. A system so well-oiled that wrongdoing didn't derail it, it became part of the cost of doing business. The record labels that never stopped cutting checks as long as the hits kept coming. The lawyers who buried settlements behind airtight NDAs, transforming accountability into legal paperwork and silence into a contractual obligation. The executives who asked no questions, the gatekeepers who looked the other way, and the artists who stayed loyal not because they believed in innocence, but because loyalty paid better than truth ever could. In that ecosystem, careers were built on compliance, reputations were protected by omission, and speaking up wasn't framed as courage, it was framed as career suicide. And here's the part most people are missing: what you've seen so far isn't the most dangerous footage. According to multiple insiders, there's still one recording no one has released yet. A private conversation buried deep in hours of footage that doesn't just implicate one person, but threatens to pull another powerful figure into the fire. And that's why some people are doing everything they can to keep it buried, because secrets don't disappear when they're hidden. They accumulate weight. They sit under pressure, growing heavier with every year they're ignored, denied, or strategically forgotten. And when they finally surface, they don't rise gently, they erupt. The loudest secrets are always the ones nobody ever wanted you to hear, not because they're untrue, but because too many people built their lives, their power, and their protection around keeping them hidden. What's already been revealed has shattered carefully maintained illusions, but what comes next has the potential to redraw the entire landscape. Not just exposing individuals, but exposing systems, networks of loyalty, fear, money, and silence that thrived in darkness for decades. The documentary closed its final frame, but the narrative itself is still unfolding, still unraveling, still demanding answers. And history is clear about one thing: once silence breaks, it never fully returns. This isn't the aftermath. This is the beginning. Budden's point was unsettling because it widened the blast radius. This wasn't the familiar narrative of one powerful man falling from grace after going too far. This was a machine being exposed, one that required participation at every level to function. Money kept it running, fear kept it quiet, mutual self-interest kept it stable, and for decades it worked. The documentary didn't invent that machine, it simply turned on the lights. Under that unforgiving glare, what looked like individual moral failure began to resemble organized tolerance. Not accidental, not chaotic, systemic. By mid-December, the fallout reached a point of no return. Diddy's legal team responded with sheer volume, unleashing lawsuits, injunctions, and cease and desist in rapid succession, as if overwhelming force could reverse public perception. It was a strategy built for courtrooms, not culture, but culture had already shifted. The public had emotionally moved on, and once that happens, no legal maneuver, no matter how aggressive, can restore control. The PR war was lost before it officially began, not because the lawyers were unskilled, but because belief had collapsed. And when belief collapses, authority follows. The Reckoning surged to #1 on Netflix in both the United States and the United Kingdom, dominating timelines, group chats, and late-night conversations across continents. It wasn't just being watched, it was being processed, debated, and dissected in real time. Civil cases multiplied almost overnight, each new filing emboldened by the last, as silence stopped feeling safe. Los Angeles County quietly reopened investigations that had once been shelved, delayed, or softened by influence and time. Old files were pulled, old names resurfaced, old decisions were re-examined under a very different climate.
He put his hands on females, put his hands on producers, executives. That's just his. I guess that's what the whole name Bad Boy comes from. That people don't really understand. What is it? What is a bad boy? Why did he choose that name? Like he never really gave a clear definition of how he feels about it.
Doors that had been sealed for decades through money, intimidation, legal insulation, and strategic silence were suddenly forced open. And what spilled out made it impossible to keep pretending this was ever just about one man. The documentary didn't merely expose allegations. It exposed how long those allegations had been known, how thoroughly they had been managed, and how many people had benefited from keeping them contained. What was unraveling wasn't just a legacy. It was an entire way of doing business, one built on the assumption that power, once accumulated, could protect itself forever. Inside a New Jersey prison, Diddy sat alone in a hard plastic chair, his posture rigid, his surroundings stripped of every symbol of power he once commanded. The room was quiet except for the low hum of fluorescent lights and the faint crackle of a flickering television mounted high on the wall. On that screen, his world was unraveling in real time. There were no handlers leaning into whispered damage control strategies, no assistants rushing to intercept bad news, no lawyers shaping language before it reached the public. For the first time in decades, the machinery that once protected him was gone. There was no buffer between him and the consequences of his past. Every image that played, every headline that scrolled, peeled away another layer of insulation. The empire he had built on influence, intimidation, and carefully managed perception was collapsing without him being able to intervene. Power meant nothing here. Reputation meant nothing. Control, the thing he valued above all else, was completely out of reach. What made the moment even more brutal was its inevitability. This wasn't a sudden ambush. It was the delayed result of years spent believing that wealth and fear could permanently outrun accountability. Watching from that plastic chair, Diddy wasn't just witnessing public backlash. He was confronting the reality that the narrative no longer belonged to him. It was being written without his permission, shaped by voices he could no longer silence, and consumed by an audience that no longer feared him. There was nowhere left to hide, no version of events he could spin, no ally powerful enough to shut it all down. What remained was consequence, slow, relentless, and impossible to negotiate. When 50 Cent was asked why he chose this moment to speak, he didn't hesitate and he didn't soften his language. He said Diddy was a predator who had gone unchecked for far too long, protected by a combination of money, fear, and calculated silence. According to 50, the system didn't fail, it functioned exactly as designed. Accountability wasn't avoided, it was postponed. Delayed by influence, buried under settlements, and suffocated by people who were too afraid or too comfortable to challenge power. But delay, he argued, was never the same as escape. Eventually, the truth demands its turn. The footage at the center of the documentary, 50 explained, was never meant to be released. Everyone involved knew that. They had been warned repeatedly. It was too explosive, too risky, too dangerous to ever see daylight. Not because it was unclear or misleading, but because it was devastatingly clear. The kind of material that doesn't just tarnish reputations or end careers, but permanently alters how a legacy is remembered. Once it surfaced, there would be no reframing it as misunderstanding, no rebranding it as controversy, no waiting it out until public attention moved on. History itself would have to be rewritten. That was the real threat, not scandal, but permanence. The footage didn't offer speculation or rumor, it offered evidence. And evidence, once released, doesn't fade. It changes how people look back, how institutions defend themselves, and how silence is judged in hindsight. In that prison room, as the screen continued to glow, Diddy wasn't just watching his present collapse. He was watching the past catch up to him, every moment he thought would stay buried finally stepping into the light. But somewhere between a quiet betrayal inside Diddy's own inner circle and 50 Cent's ruthless, almost surgical patience, the recording that was never meant to exist outside locked drives and whispered warnings finally surfaced. It didn't leak in fragments, it wasn't teased, it wasn't softened by advanced rumors or carefully planted denials. There were no trial balloons floated to gauge public reaction, no anonymous sources hinting at what was coming. It arrived whole and unannounced, like a controlled detonation. Sudden, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. The kind of release that leaves no time to prepare defenses, align allies, or rewrite the story before the world sees it for what it is. Just impact, raw, undeniable, and irreversible. December 1st, 2025 became more than a date. It became a dividing line. Before it, Diddy was still a man who believed he could outmaneuver consequences, outrun accountability, and bend reality through influence and eye. Intimidation. After it, he was something else entirely, a spectator to his own collapse. That was the day the most powerful man in hip-hop stopped dictating the rules of the game and started watching his downfall unfold from a prison television, separated from the outside world by concrete walls and locked doors. For the first time, events were moving without him. Decisions were being made without his input, stories were being told without his approval, and that was the true loss, not freedom. Not status, not even legacy, at least not yet. The king of control lost the one thing he could never afford to lose, the narrative. For decades, narrative had been his greatest weapon. It was how scandals were reframed as misunderstandings, how accusations were buried under success, how critics were dismissed as jealous or disloyal. Narrative was the shield that made power feel permanent. But once it slipped from his grasp, everything else began to unravel. Power without narrative became noise. Influence without narrative became hollow. Wealth without narrative became defensive, reactive, afraid. From that moment forward, the story no longer moved at his command. It moved on its own. It was shaped by evidence instead of image, by testimony instead of intimidation, by voices that had waited years, sometimes decades, for the chance to speak without fear. What had once been a carefully curated myth turned into documented reality, frame by frame, word by word. And locked inside that prison, watching it all unfold on a flickering screen, Diddy wasn't just witnessing the collapse of his present. He was watching the final erosion of the one illusion that had protected him for a lifetime, the belief that he would always control how the story was told. This wasn't just a documentary. It was an execution, slow, deliberate, and carried out in full public view. There was no rush, no chaos, no accident in its timing or construction. Every moment felt intentional, calibrated to strip power piece by piece rather than all at once. And the man holding the blade wasn't a judge, a prosecutor, or a government authority. It was his oldest rival, the one figure who understood both the mythology and the machinery well enough to dismantle it from the inside. This wasn't justice delivered by institutions. It was reckoning delivered by someone who had waited, watched, and remembered. In the days leading up to the release, Diddy's legal team went into overdrive. Panic replaced strategy. They tried to stop Netflix at every possible angle, flooding the process with objections, threats, and last-minute maneuvers designed to delay or derail the premiere altogether. Their primary argument was simple but aggressive. The project was propaganda. They pointed directly at Curtis, 50 Cent Jackson's involvement as executive producer, claiming the documentary was nothing more than a personal vendetta dressed up as journalism. The implication was clear: this wasn't truth, it was revenge.
Look at how many people he affected negatively. That was his trade-off, to gain what he had. His former bodyguard, Gene Deal, said he seen him doing a ritual where they dub.
Netflix shut that argument down immediately, publicly and unequivocally. They clarified that 50 Cent had no creative control over the documentary's content, no authority over editorial decisions, no hand on the final cut. The platform stood by its process, its sourcing, and its legal footing. That response alone sent a message. This wasn't something Netflix was afraid to defend. The ground beneath Diddy's team began to shift, and they felt it. By the night before the premiere, desperation had fully set in. With no leverage left and no allies able to stop the release, a cease and desist was rushed out in a final attempt to create doubt where certainty already existed. The letter accused the documentary of relying on stolen footage and illegally obtained private recordings, material they claimed never meant for public eyes. It was a familiar tactic: question the source, poison the process, and hope confusion could delay impact. But it was too late. The argument didn't land as a warning, it landed as confirmation. To the public, it sounded less like a legal defense and more like panic, less like confidence and more like fear of what was about to be seen. The clock kept ticking, the premiere stayed locked, and as the countdown reached zero, it became clear that no legal language, no last-minute filing, and no accusation could stop what was already in motion. The execution was set, and this time there would be no appeal. Those recordings were devastating in a way no accusation, lawsuit, or rumor could ever be. They didn't rely on interpretation or hindsight. They didn't ask the audience to choose sides. They simply showed the truth unfolding in real time. Over the 6 days leading up to his September 2024 arrest, the cameras captured Diddy as the walls closed in, unfiltered, unguarded, and increasingly frantic. He ranted in private rooms, paced endlessly, snapped at anyone within reach, and demanded absolute loyalty from people who had already begun quietly planning their exits. The fear was palpable, the control was slipping, and every attempt to tighten his grip only revealed how much he was losing it. What made the footage even more damning was its origin. These weren't covert recordings planted by enemies or investigators. They weren't hacked files or stolen surveillance. They were filmed by cameras Diddy himself had hired, tools he believed would protect him, shape his legacy, and one day frame a triumphant comeback. He thought he was documenting resilience. Instead, he documented collapse. Every second was recorded with his knowledge. Every outburst, every threat, every paranoid spiral was self-inflicted. There was no one else to blame. The record was complete because he made it so. The irony was merciless. Diddy's lifelong obsession with controlling perception, curating angles, managing appearances, engineering narratives became the very instrument of his undoing. The machinery he built to dominate the story turned into evidence of his unraveling. Viewers watched him scream at producers when they didn't move fast enough, intimidate assistants into silence, and bark orders as if authority alone could hold reality in place. What emerged on screen wasn't the polished mogul or the charismatic tastemaker. It was a side of Bad Boy that felt less like branding and more like confession, raw entitlement stripped of charm, power exposed without polish. The clips revealed something deeper than anger. They showed paranoia, a man scanning every room for betrayal, a man who had spent so long controlling others that the idea of losing control sent him spiraling. The confidence that once defined him curdled into suspicion. The swagger collapsed into fear. Each moment felt heavier than the last, not because it was dramatic, but because it was unavoidably human in its desperation. Then came the clip that detonated across social media and lodged itself permanently in the public consciousness. Diddy is seen smiling warmly for fans on the streets of Harlem, posing for photos, laughing, projecting familiarity and gratitude. It's the version of himself he had perfected over decades, approachable, charismatic, rooted in the community that helped build him. Seconds later, as soon as the cameras pull back and the crowd thins, the mask slips. His posture changes, his face tightens. He recoils, leans in, and whispers urgently for hand sanitizer as if the very touch of the people who adored him suddenly repulsed him. The contrast was devastating in its simplicity. No narration was needed, no accusation required. In one uninterrupted moment, the distance between the public persona and the private reality became undeniable. Public charm. Private contempt, it wasn't just hypocrisy on display, it was exposure. The kind that can't be spun, reframed, or explained away, because it wasn't something someone said about him. It was something he revealed himself on camera, believing the footage would never leave his control, and that was the most damning. In part of all, the recordings didn't portray a man misunderstood or unfairly targeted. They showed a man exactly as he was when he thought no one who mattered was watching, when the illusion of safety was still intact, when he still believed the narrative belonged to him. Once those moments escaped into the public eye, there was no going back. The image shattered not from attack, but from self-exposure. His lawyers responded exactly as expected by shouting attorney-client privilege, insisting that private strategy sessions had been exposed illegally and that sacred legal boundaries had been crossed. They framed the footage as a violation, an unethical intrusion into spaces that were never meant for public view. But none of it mattered. The argument arrived too late, and more importantly, it landed without credibility. The damage had already been done, not because of how the footage was obtained, but because of what it showed. Once the public saw it, the question of legality became secondary to the reality unfolding on screen. The narrative had shifted beyond repair. No legal language could unring that bell. Netflix didn't flinch. The platform stood its ground, calmly and confidently confirming that the footage had been obtained legally, that all rights had been secured, and that sources were fully protected. There was no hesitation in their response, no backtracking, no attempt to soften the blow. It was a quiet but unmistakable show of confidence, one that signaled this wasn't a reckless release but a calculated one built on due diligence and legal certainty. The contrast was stark, panic on one side, composure on the other. Then came the line that sealed the moment, delivered by director Alexandria Stapleton. She didn't raise her voice or dramatize the point. She simply stated the truth. Diddy had spent decades filming himself because he wanted the world behind the scenes. He wanted control over how history would remember him. He wanted to curate the myth from every angle, and now she said the world was behind the scenes. The sentence landed with devastating clarity. What was once a tool of power had become a window of exposure. The camera that was meant to protect him no longer belonged to him. It belonged to everyone. And once the curtain was pulled back, there was no way to close it again. When Netflix initially reached out for comment, Diddy's camp chose silence, a familiar tactic, one that had worked countless times before. No statements, no denials, no engagement. The hope was clear: starve the story of oxygen and wait for the moment to pass. But this time, silence didn't signal confidence, it created a vacuum. And the moment the documentary premiered, that vacuum filled with panic. Carefully maintained restraint collapsed overnight. Statements began pouring out. Accusations were hurled at Netflix, at 50 Cent, at unnamed enemies and conspirators. Legal language was rushed into the public space, attempting to regain control through volume alone. But it was already too late. The narrative had moved on without them.
Everyone, the judge, the attorneys, the witnesses' attorneys, the accusers' attorneys, they all have to adhere to these professional rules. They all have to adhere to this professional conduct. And if this continues, and if more things are said that get onto
the conversation had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer about whether Diddy was guilty or innocent. That question had quietly slipped off the table. Instead, the focus turned to scale and complicity. How much had been hidden, for how long, and most dangerously, who had helped keep it buried? Each new attempt at deflection only sharpened those questions, drawing attention not away from the footage, but deeper into it. Every denial felt less like a defense and more like confirmation that there was far more beneath the surface than anyone had been willing to admit. Then came the twist that shattered what remained of Diddy's defense. Michael Oberle, Diddy's personal documentarian, the man trusted to capture his life, his image, his comeback, stepped forward with a revelation that changed everything. He hadn't leaked the footage. The betrayal hadn't come from the outside, it had come from within. Someone inside Diddy's own inner circle had broken ranks. During a brief window when Diddy was out of state for 3 days, trust was violated, access was exploited, and files that were never meant to leave private storage were taken. Opportunity met motive, and someone seized it. Whether that decision was driven by money, revenge, fear, or sheer chaos no longer mattered. What mattered was the result. The recordings didn't drift anonymously into the public sphere. They landed with precision, delivered directly to 50 Cent's team. Oberle called it a betrayal of trust, the ultimate violation of an already fractured inner circle. The internet had a different name for it. Karma. 50 Cent called it strategy, and everything that followed made it clear this was never about impulse or emotion. He didn't simply release the documentary and let public outrage do the work. He engineered a sequence. Every move was timed, every appearance calculated, every silence deliberate. This wasn't exposure as a byproduct of truth, it was exposure as a tool. When his interview aired on Good Morning America, it wasn't coincidence or convenience, it was placement. One of the few programs reliably broadcast inside federal prisons. One of the few screens Diddy couldn't turn off, mute, or walk away from. 50 knew exactly where Diddy would be, exactly what he would be watching, and exactly how powerless that moment would feel. This wasn't just about speaking to the public. It was about speaking directly to the man who had lost control of the story. In the days that followed, the tone shifted again. The reveal was over, now came reinforcement. The trolling began, not chaotic, not reckless, but precise. Memes about prison television access flooded social media, jokes about truth being unavoidable. About screens you can't switch off. About stories you're forced to sit with whether you like them or not. On the surface it looked petty, online noise, cheap shots, but underneath it was something colder and far more intentional. Pettiness became psychological warfare. Every post served the same purpose, to remind Diddy that the control he once exercised over others was gone, and that the same tools he used to dominate perception were now being used against him. This wasn't humiliation for entertainment. It was humiliation as leverage, a public demonstration that power had changed hands. Diddy couldn't hide behind lawyers, he couldn't silence witnesses, he couldn't redirect attention or drown the narrative in distraction. For years, he dictated when stories started and when they stopped. Now the story ran on its own, looping endlessly, replayed on screens he couldn't escape. Every meme, every joke, every clip reinforced the same reality. The truth no longer needed his permission to exist. What made it especially devastating was the reversal. The man who once thrived on intimidation, who used fear and access as currency, was now stripped of both. He wasn't responding, he wasn't countering, he was watching. A spectator to his own dismantling, forced to absorb it in real time, without influence, without allies, without a voice. The walls that once symbolized protection now functioned as confinement, not just physically but psychologically. This wasn't exposure designed to shock and move on. It was disempowerment sustained over time, a slow erosion of authority, identity, and control. A reminder that dominance only works as long as people believe in it, and once belief collapses, power follows. In that moment, the balance didn't merely shift, it inverted. The man who once controlled the narrative became trapped inside it, while the architect of his undoing watched from the outside, patient, deliberate, and fully aware that the most effective punishment isn't silence. It's being forced to listen when you no longer get to speak. Then came the clip that erased any remaining ambiguity and ended the debate entirely. It wasn't framed as speculation or interpretation. It was presented as a moment captured in real time, raw and unfiltered. In the footage, Diddy allegedly threatens ass. Omion after showing them a so-called freak-off video, making the warning unmistakably clear: if they didn't comply again, the footage would be released. There was no charm, no persuasion, no illusion of consent, just leverage, just fear. Legal analysts were quick to point out the gravity of that moment. If a jury believes Cassie's account, they said that single clip alone could be enough to seal the case. Not as circumstantial evidence, not as context, but as direct proof. That wasn't seduction. It wasn't persuasion, it was intimidation laid bare in a way that stripped away every possible defense, and the documentary didn't stop there. It widened the lens, pulling back from that single moment to expose the environment that made it possible. The infamous white parties, long dismissed as extravagant celebrity indulgence, were reframed as something far more troubling. What once looked like excess now read as warning signs. Police were called 14 times over 7 years. Not for noise complaints alone, but for guests wandering the streets at dawn, disoriented, shaking, confused, sometimes barefoot, sometimes crying, often unable to explain what had happened inside. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns hiding in plain sight, the testament layered on top of one another with unsettling consistency. A 16-year-old alleging coercion at a white party in 1998, describing it as a twisted rite of passage disguised as opportunity. A security guard claiming he was drugged and assaulted in 2006, only to be quietly dismissed and replaced. An adult performer recounting systematic grooming across multiple events where boundaries dissolved, exits were controlled, and refusal carried consequences. Each story on its own was disturbing. Together they formed something undeniable. Patterns emerged, not chaos but structure, not coincidence but repetition. The documentary made it clear that these weren't random scandals or misunderstandings blown out of proportion. They were symptoms of a system, one designed to blur lines, isolate victims, and protect power at all costs. What had once been written off as rumors or excess was now reframed as infrastructure, a culture built to enable, to normalize, and to silence. And once that system was visible, it became impossible to pretend it had ever been accidental. Days before his arrest, in a moment that now feels almost prophetic, Diddy muttered to his lawyers, "We're losing." It wasn't bravado, it wasn't strategy, it was resignation. A rare admission that the momentum had shifted beyond recovery, and he was right. What followed confirmed it in devastating detail. Former executives who once protected the brand began speaking openly. Bodyguards who had enforced silence for years broke down on camera, their voices shaking as they described what they had seen and carried alone. Artists who once owed their careers to proximity stepped forward, no longer willing to trade their truth for protection. Security chiefs, men whose job had been to control access and erase problems, finally said out loud what had always been whispered behind closed doors. What made these moments so powerful wasn't just the content of their testimonies, but the emotion behind them. Tears, hesitation, long pauses where fear used to live. The cost of silence was etched into every word, and once those voices began speaking, something irreversible happened.
The book, Porter allegedly recounts discovering and making copies of the tapes that Diddy made of himself having with young boys that he was managing, including...
The spell broke. The silence that had insulated the empire for decades finally shattered, not because it was challenged head-on, but because it was no longer feared. Empires built on silence survive only as long as people believe speaking will destroy them. The moment that belief disappears, power collapses. This wasn't a slow leak. It wasn't a controlled unraveling. The dam didn't crack under pressure, it gave way completely. Years of suppressed stories, buried incidents, and enforced compliance surged forward all at once. There was no containment, no repair, no narrative strong enough to hold it back. What collapsed wasn't just a reputation or a career, it was the illusion that fear could last forever. And once that illusion fell, everything built on top of it followed. The documentary may have ended, but the reckoning it ignited is nowhere near finished. What the world has already seen feels less like a conclusion and more like the lifting of a curtain. The credits rolled, the screen went dark, but the story kept moving quietly, relentlessly beyond the frame. More tapes exist. Not fragments or rumors, but full recordings, untouched and intact, still sitting somewhere in digital silence. Within them are more voices, more moments, more names, people who believed their words would never travel beyond locked rooms and trusted circles. And right now, as each new revelation ripples outward, someone somewhere is watching with growing fear, fully aware that what has already surfaced may only be the beginning of a much larger exposure. That's why the real question has shifted. It's no longer about how deep this goes. That question has already been answered. The depth is undeniable. The more unsettling question is how wide the fallout will spread, and how many people are about to be dragged into the light when the next tape drops. Every new disclosure resets the stakes. It emboldens those who have stayed silent. It tightens the pressure on those who believe their position, their money, or their influence would protect them forever. Silence, once broken, has a way of cascading. One voice creates space for another. One truth makes the next impossible to contain, because secrets don't disappear when they're buried. They accumulate weight. They sit under pressure, growing heavier with every year they're ignored, denied, or strategically forgotten. And when they finally surface, they don't rise gently, they erupt. The loudest secrets are always the ones nobody ever wanted you to hear, not because they're untrue, but because too many people built their lives, their power, and their protection around keeping them hidden. This story isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. What's already been revealed has shattered carefully maintained illusions, but what comes next has the potential to redraw the entire landscape, to expose not just individuals, but patterns, alliances, and systems that thrived in darkness. The documentary may have closed on its final frame, but the narrative itself is still unfolding, still unraveling, still demanding answers. And if history has taught us anything, it's this: once silence breaks, it never fully returns. This isn't the aftermath. This is the beginning. If you want to stay ahead of this story as it continues to unfold, before the next tape drops and before the next name surfaces, make sure you're subscribed. Drop your theory in the comments. How deep do you think this really goes? And remember, stay sharp, stay skeptical, because the most dangerous truths are always the ones someone never wanted you to hear.